We're going to make a start on time, 6:30. Good evening, everyone. It's great to see you all here. My name is Imabongi Moren, and I'm an assistant professor in the International History Department here at the LSE. And it is my pleasure to be chairing this event this evening. This event is part of the LSE Library's year-long programme to mark the centenary of the Representation of the People Act 1918, where all men and some women got the vote for the first time. LSE Library's events programme draws on the rich material in the Women's Library collection to commemorate the campaigns for women's suffrage and the innovative methods used to get the vote. It includes introductions to new books, talks, hands-on activities for adults and families, performance, summer exhibitions, and online school resources. We are very glad to be joined this evening by our speaker, Sumita Mukherjee, a historian of the British Empire and the Indian subcontinent. Mukherjee writes about the history of South Asians in Britain, the history of women's rights in India, and the global effects of Indian migration. Her research investigates the transnational migration of South Asian people during the time of empire, and she is particularly interested in issues of representation, identity, and nationalism, as well as the effects of travel and the use of imperial and global networks. Sumita Mukherjee was awarded her PhD from the University of Oxford in 2007, and since then has held lectureship positions at the University of Glasgow and the University of Oxford. She's also taught at De Montfort University, the University of Cambridge, King's College London, and here at the London School of Economics. And Mukherjee is currently a senior lecturer in history at the University of Bristol. Mukherjee plays an active role within the historical community. She is Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, a member of the Steering Committee of the Women's History Network, a member of the editorial board for the journal Women's History Review, and member of the editorial collective for the journal Gender and History. Her first book, Nationalism, Education and Migrant Identities, The England Returned, was published in 2009, and since then she has co-edited 3 books and published a number of articles and chapters interrogating the networks and reception to South Asian migrants in Britain and women's rights. Tonight, Sumita Mukherjee will be talking about and launching her new book published by Oxford University Press. Congratulations. Copies of which are going to be sold here, and you get a 30% discount. Okay, you get a discount, so please take an opportunity. And the book is titled Indian Suffragettes, Female Identities and Transnational Networks. Now, this research was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council's Early Career Leadership Fellowship, which Sumita had between 2015 and 2017. Her book looks at the activities of Indian campaigners for the female vote in Asia, Europe, and the USA, and Britain and other parts of the British Empire, and how they had an impact on campaigns in the Indian subcontinent. In her talk today, Mukherjee will discuss the experiences of the Indian suffragettes who travelled around the world to lobby the British Parliament, attend international women's conferences, and conduct speaking tours. She will demonstrate the ways in which the suffrage movement was a truly global enterprise, not solely confined to Britain or America, that involved and affected women from a range of diverse backgrounds. And after Mukherjee's talk, we're going to open it up for question and answers from you, so please be thinking of questions as she's talking. But without further ado, please join me in giving the warmest of welcomes to Sumita Mukherjee.
Thank you, Imabong. It's lovely to see so many friendly faces here, so thank you all for coming out. I want to start by thanking Gillian Murphy, who invited me to speak here tonight, and I'm really honoured to be part of this year-long suffrage centenary celebration that's going on at the LSE and the Women's Library. I'm really honoured also to be speaking at the time when the exhibition is open, so please do, if you haven't already, have a look at the suffrage exhibition that Gillian Murphy and others have been involved in curating, which is in the front foyer of the LSE Library. I also want to thank Imabong as well for introducing me, and I should say that her book, Race, Woman, is out next month, and I think we've got lots of interest, so do look out for her book as well. Okay, so I don't know how long I'm going to talk, maybe about 30, 40 minutes, we'll see how we go. It's really difficult to work out how to condense 90,000 words, 250 pages into a talk. So what I'm going to do today is try and give a bit of an overview of a few things. I want to give, so kind of 3 parts. I want to tell you a little bit about how and why I wrote this book, a little bit about why this book has become quite political. It's kind of politicized me, and I feel that the book itself is a political act almost in its publication. And then I'll give a little overview of what I've done with the book. So what I won't necessarily do is actually go into any of the details of the women that I discuss, of the conferences, petitions, organisations and everything else, but hopefully, just as I said, give you an overview that will encourage you hopefully to look at the book itself to get more details. As I said, the book is actually not on sale today. They're just display copies, which you're really welcome to have a look at afterwards. And I would just say encourage librarians to purchase this book rather than yourselves. Right. Let me start with thinking. So I want to start then, as I said, with giving you a little bit of overview of why and how I came to write this book. Because this book has been gestating, I guess, in my mind for quite a long time. But the publication in 2008 was strategic. It was strategic to come out in this partial centenary of suffrage in Britain, even though, as I will reiterate a number of times, this is not really about Britain. This is actually about India. So many of the seeds for this book came out of writing a little chapter about Sophia Dilip Singh, who some of you may know about. I'll come to in a second. In a collection that I edited and co-wrote with my good friend Rana Ahmed, who's here in the audience, which came out in 2011, which is about, it was called South Asian Resistances in Britain. And we were thinking, when we put together this collection with a number of contributors, but how do we think about the ways in which South Asian, people of South Asian descent in Britain resisted or kind of were involved in different forms of resistance which were different from just violence against the state. So I wrote this chapter about Sophia Dilip Singh, who was a British woman of Indian descent. She was born in Norfolk. She was involved in the British suffrage movement in the 1910s. And I talked about her connections with 2 Indian women who came to Britain in 1919, who were involved in campaigning for the vote in India. And in writing that chapter and in writing the collection, or kind of editing the collection with Rahana, really thinking then about different ways in which just almost the presence of women on the public stage in itself is a form of resistance and challenges our ideas of how people can perform political acts. Moving on from, so I wrote this chapter, but I wasn't really interested in doing anything more about suffrage. I was planning to write a totally different book, which is going to be about religious figures, and yeah, I won't go into that. I was kind of on a path to do something very different. But I guess there are kind of a few things that inspired me or encouraged me to think about writing a book about suffrage. One of them was the London Olympics in the summer of 2012. Some of you may remember the opening ceremony, which had all those symbols of British history, and also included the suffragettes, so Helen Pankhurst, the great granddaughter of Emmeline Pankhurst, and her own daughter were there. And I remember watching the opening ceremony, and they interviewed Helen Pankhurst and her daughter. I thought that was quite interesting that suffrage had been kind of involved and included in that opening ceremony. And then there was the Delhi rape case, which which occurred in December 2012. And I was, as I'm sure many of you, was struck by how horrific that event was, but also I guess, it put women's rights and the history of women's rights in India kind of on a international stage and in kind of a public media sense. But lots of people were interested in what was going on in India, what was going on about women's position in India and in Indian society and so forth. So I'd already written about suffrage, I'd written about Indian women, I'd interested in lots of different things. I teach Indian history. And I kind of thought that there was scope in writing a history about Indian women who fought for the vote, and really trying to put them centre stage, trying to think about how that links to some of the contemporary challenges of feminism, and the ways in which we think about women's history. So as Imbong said, I was very lucky in, it started in 2015, but I was awarded in 2014 to win a 2-year grant from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which gave me the money and time to research this book. I was able to go to archives in India, in Ireland, in the USA, in Switzerland, also in Britain. I also corresponded with archivists and archives that I couldn't visit, so in Japan and Australia and other parts of America. And I was able to slowly gather a lot of material, which brings me to what this book is all about. So this book is about the ways in which Indian women were campaigning for the vote and how in India, but also how they were engaging with debates around the vote around the world. So my interest is very much in migration and in travel and in networks and how when people move and they either travel or migrate, how their identities are shaped and changed by that movement of being away from wherever they grew up, and also through the people and experience, the people that they meet and the experiences they have when they go abroad. If that makes sense. So in this book, I wanted to write a book which was about, not just about suffrage. When I was putting together the grant application for this research, I spoke to a senior female historian who writes on very economic history, and she was very poo-pooey about doing the history about suffrage. Oh no, that's really boring. The kind of traditional idea of women's history is not exciting. You won't get any money for this. No one's going to, it's kind of very, very niche. You've got to do something much more exciting. You wanted migration. So I'm really glad that she was proved wrong. But this book is in some ways, it is about suffrage, but it's not about suffrage only. It's also about how the movement of women, so in this case, the movement of Indian women, how when they leave India and they interact with, in this case, other feminist campaigners who are interested in campaigning for the vote, how that changes their own ideas about themselves. It changes the ways in which they can think about the possibilities of political campaigning back in India. It changes the ways in which they think about their position in the world, their position in racial and imperial hierarchies that existed at the time. Change their ideas of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a citizen, and what the vote actually means, what it means to have a vote in a democratic and hopefully a democratic institution. So I'll come back to a little bit more about what the book is about. But I want to then kind of move, still talking about how I was writing this and what I was writing, and kind of moving on to some of the political aspects of how this book was formed and some of the influences on this. So in 2015, while I was in India, I was in Delhi, I was researching some of these Indian women, and the Suffragette film came out, which many of you may have seen. And I was contacted by a journalist, even though I was in Delhi, who said, "We want your comments on the film. There's been a lot of interest in this film and lots of concerns that there are no women of colour who are represented in the film. We know that you've written a chapter about Suffragette Singh, who was a woman of colour, who was involved in the British suffrage movement. What do you think about this film? I hadn't seen the film, so I said, I can't comment on the film itself, but I did suggest that the film in itself was not necessarily historically inaccurate. There aren't, the film was just a small snapshot of one case study of this one woman who was based in the East End of London, a working class woman, and it was about her story, and it wasn't about the whole suffrage movement in Britain. But yes, Suffragette Singh was this woman who was of Indian and Ethiopian ethnicity, who was involved in the suffrage movement. And there may have been other women of colour who were involved in the suffrage movement, but there's very little archival material around them. What we do know, though, is that even if there weren't very many women of colour who were involved in the suffrage movement, in the 1910s, when the suffrage movement in Britain was at its height, we know that there were hundreds of women of Chinese, Caribbean, African, Indian ethnicity who lived in Britain. So, as many other commentators suggested, perhaps at least in the extras, in the kind of crowd scenes of that film, they could have reflected the historical accuracies of racial diversity that existed in Britain. When I came back from India, I actually met with Sarah Gavron, the director of the film, and I was involved in two public events where we had kind of a question answer after screenings of the film, where time and time and again the question that would be directed to me as the kind of so-called experts on Indian suffragettes and women of colour in the movement is, were there more women of colour who were involved in the British suffrage movement? Again, I may get this question after I speak today. And it really started to interest me how and why this question kept on coming up. I thought, in one way, this is a good thing. There's almost an acknowledgement, which hadn't necessarily been there a few years ago, that Britain was racially diverse in the 1910s. There are people who are acknowledging this. They're saying that there's perhaps an omission in the public discussion of the suffrage movement. But I also kept on thinking, why is there so much focus on Britain? And so for those of you who have seen the film, you will know that in the end credits, there's a timeline which is depicted, which shows a timeline of all the years when other countries grant women suffrage. And I kept on saying, well, yes, have a think about that timeline. So I was writing this book over 2015, 2016, giving kind of various talks here and there about some of my research. And then Brexit happened. And I was kind of thinking, well, why is so much interest in Britain? Why is there so much interest in Britain? And then with all, there's so many debates and media coverage and so forth going on around Brexit. And I kind of thought, to me, that seems to me, whether you voted to remain or leave or whatever your political persuasion, it seems to me that there seems to be a lot of concentration on Britain as the centre of Europe, the centre of the world, the centre of history, the centre of suffrage history, and everyone's always talking about Britain and Britain. And so the writing of this book became even more political in that I've been involved in events, including one with Imabong, which we're involved in Parliament in February, in really kind of encouraging you all and really questioning why there is so much focus on Britain when we are talking about suffrage. Now, I totally understand that 2018 is the centenary of Britain giving some women the vote, and that's a great anniversary to celebrate, and there's so much history, there's such really great books that have been written this year, such great research about the centenary. There's a great exhibition out here in the LSE Library. But it wasn't only in Britain that women fought for the vote, or fought for the vote. Women around the world were fighting for the vote. Britain was not the first country to give women the vote. Australia and New Zealand gave women the vote much, much earlier than Britain. And in fact, the first women in India got the vote in 1921, which is only 3 years after the first women in Britain started getting the vote. So, yeah, so I guess I kind of want to say that because I think this has become a particular bugbear, I guess, of mine. I just wanted to kind of lay that out there at the start before I get into what the book is about. And okay, so there was that kind of bugbear. There's also the bugbear when, for those of you who may know about Indian history, who may know about Indian nationalism and Indian independence, I got a lot of comments for those who do know about this or who think they know about this, who would say, well, there wasn't a suffrage movement in India because women were given the vote after independence. Adult suffrage was introduced in India in 1949, after independence, for all men and all women. There was no campaign for the vote by women in India because it was an imperial system and it just didn't exist. And that really annoys me still as well, because as my book shows, that's not the case. Indian women were campaigning for the vote in India from 1917 onwards. There might have been small-scale discussions around it beforehand, but in 1917 there was an official deputation by Indian women to the then Viceroy and Secretary of State of India demanding the vote for women in India. Now, there are some complications to the situation in India before 1947, because India was part of the British Empire. It was subject to the British Crown. So demanding the vote when you don't actually have independence from imperial rule is quite a complicated situation. And that's really, I guess, the central issue that I engage with in this book, and thinking about how these women are trying to campaign for a vote in a system which is still not quite democratic, and yet they still want to have a say in that still not quite democratic system, which is obviously very different from demanding the vote in so-called free countries like Britain. Okay. So now what I want to do is talk a little bit more in detail about some of the things that I talk about in this book. And you can see I kind of postmarked a few things that I just want to read out. I've been to talks before when people read from the book, and I know it's often quite hard to follow what they're saying, so hopefully this will work. We'll see. We'll see how we go. But I just wanted to give you, to start with kind of outlining then the trajectory of the women in India who are campaigning for vote and what this all means. So the first public demands, as I said, for the female suffrage in India took place in 1917, when an official deputation of 14 women went to see the Viceroy and the Secretary of State for India and to demand the vote. And this was actually the first time that they could actually demand the vote, because before then there were no democratic assemblies in India anyway. Some women did have the vote in village councils and in kind of town municipal councils before 1917. But in 1917, the Viceroy and Secretary of State for India came to India to discuss the implementation of some form of a democratic assembly in India for Indians. So before that, basically India was ruled by the Viceroy, who's kind of a governor, with his own nominated council of British officials, and there was no democratic means that Indian people could have a say in the governance of India, of course, because it was under imperial rule. In 1919, after the Viceroy and Secretary of State had various consultations, the Government of India Act created a new central legislative assembly. So this is the first time that there's a democratic assembly that's introduced in India, and a new male electorate. So in forming this new democratic assembly, despite this official deputation and various unofficial deputations as well, the government of India and Britain decided that they would not include women in that franchise, in that new assembly that they were setting up. And they had a perfect opportunity in 1918 to do so, but they deliberately and very deliberately excluded women from the franchise. So as a new male franchise, and just to kind of put all of this into context, only 3% of Indian men were enfranchised in 1919 to vote in for representation so it's kind of a complicated system. So in India, after 1919, you had a central parliament that was set up, and you also had parliaments set up in the provinces. And so at the same time that they were set up, and men could vote in those provinces, and then they could then get a vote in. If you had a vote in the provinces, you then got a vote in the central parliament when their elections came around. Okay. So the government of India had suggested then that, or had deliberately excluded women from the vote in 1919, but what they did say was that the provinces could decide for themselves if they wanted to enfranchise women. And so these new provincial parliaments were set up, new MPs were elected in them, and if they had a debate and a vote in those provincial parliaments to enfranchise women, then they could do so. And so immediately women were campaigning in the provinces so that they could get a vote in those provincial parliaments, which would then, as I said, would give them, even though it was a provincial vote, they would then also get a vote in the national elections. And so Madras and Bombay gave women the vote in 1921, following debates in their provincial parliaments, which then, as I said, gave them a national vote. But as I said, only 3% of Indian men were enfranchised at this time. So you can imagine how few Indian women were enfranchised, especially because, as in Britain, franchise rights were dependent on property rights. So you could only have the vote in India if you owned property, and very few Indian women owned property at this time, partly because there were actually inheritance laws which prohibited women from inheriting property. So the number of women who were enfranchised was minuscule, but over the course of the 1920s and 30s, through various campaigns, and by 1935, across British India, all of the provinces had enfranchised women, but on a very small scale because of these property rights. Now, Indian electoral politics was also characterised by the issue of communal representation, which some of you may know that term, but some of you might not know. So India had a Hindu majority, but a very, very large Muslim population. And the British government had been concerned for a number of decades about how to, I guess, placate those different communities. Perhaps some say might implement a policy of divide and rule, actually trying to encourage divisions. So divisions between religious communities became enshrined in Indian politics through a number of cases. In 1909, the Morley-Minto reforms established the principle of quotas, so established fixed representations for Muslims in political assemblies, for what were then called depressed classes, and also for what were then called landlords. So there's a whole landlord class. And this becomes cemented over the 1930s. So there's a whole system of political quotas where certain political constituencies and communities are only allowed to vote in politicians who represent their community. So Muslim, so it wasn't in all places, but there were certain places where a Muslim electorate would have to vote in a Muslim politician to represent them. And this really characterises a lot of the debates around female franchise in India, because there were discussions around whether there should be, in the same kind of manner, women politicians who were voted in by female voters, and to have quotas for those female politicians through the electorate. Right. So what happens, though, is there are a series of political negotiations that take place over the 1930s and 40s over the nature of Indian democratic rule in India, about whether and how Britain might release some of its control over India, and how Indians might therefore get some more democratic representation and increase that franchise. So it's not only women who are campaigning for the vote or for more representation in India, but they are campaigning as a single caucus, and specifically campaigning for the right for women to be represented in these assemblies and to be involved in these negotiations and discussions around what Indian independence might be and might include. And so with these various, so there are continuing negotiations. I just want to give you a broad brush. And during these negotiations, the Indian male nationalist leaders very early on agree that they would give women the vote if they were in power. And so as we see, after Indian independence in 1947, almost immediately women are given the vote. But this is alongside a lot of men who didn't have the vote before 1947. So that's the overview of what's kind of going on in India. Excuse me. If I just very briefly, in the last kind of 10 minutes before we have minutes for questions, is to give you a little overview of what I do or try to do in the book, which is not just a history of what's going on in India, but as I said, is very much interested in the international networks and movements of Indian women who are campaigning and engaging with suffrage debates around the world. So I want to show you this. So the traditional model, and this goes back to my point a few minutes ago about Britain being seen as the centre of the world and kind of our contemporary perception still. The traditional model of writing about imperial relations and networks has been this very binary network of so we were talking about India under imperial rule, we would talk about India and Britain and their relationship as this kind of, as a binary, just the relationship that India and Britain have. And yeah, but what I want to do in this book is to really think about how when we think about India and its place in empire, and Indians who are campaigning for suffrage and thinking about citizenship and their identities and so forth, how India was not just connected to Britain, but also other parts of the empire and also other parts of the world. And so this is really the kind of conceptual framework that underpins the whole book. It's quite academic, I guess. It's inspired by a lot of geographers, but that kind of gives you a little map of what I was trying to do. And so what I do in the book is it's divided into chapters where I look at the different spaces in which Indian women were operating and engaging, and how that affected their identities, affected their campaigns for the vote, and also affected the campaigns for the vote that were taking place in the geographical spaces in which Indian women were visiting. So a lot of the focus is on Indian women who go to Britain. who are involved in the suffrage campaign in Britain in the 1910s, and then how after 1918, when partial suffrage is awarded to women in Britain, a lot of British feminist campaigners are interested in looking overseas and engaging in other suffrage campaigns around the world, and how they engage with Indian women who are living in Britain or visiting Britain, and giving them advice or encouraging them in their own campaigns. A lot of the focus is on Britain in the early stages of this book, because India is ruled by Britain. The key politicians are based in London. A lot of political campaigners from India, whatever their political motive, often have to come to London to present petitions and to lobby Parliament in London. So we see a lot of engagement with Britain. But what we see in the 1910s and 1920s is that British women who are engaging with Indian women and suffrage campaigns are often replicating racial hierarchies of empire. So British women are often exerting their own imperial superiority over Indian women. They are not necessarily listening to Indian women who've come to Britain, and not necessarily listening to the specifics of what is going on in the Indian situation, and imposing their own ideas about what they think suffrage means and should be in the Indian situation, without necessarily understanding, I said, the context. So then I move on to looking at how Indian women engaged with other parts of the British Empire. So we have Indian women who lived in South Africa and Kenya. Many of you may know there's a huge Indian diaspora who live there, and they are engaged in debates around the votes there. I also look at how Indian women engage with campaigners in Australia. So even though Australia had granted the vote to women in 1902, Aboriginal women had been excluded from a lot of the franchise in Australia. And so Indian women were they weren't engaging with Aboriginal women, but they were engaging with white Australians and discussing issues around the votes. And then they were, sorry, let me this one. And then from after the First World War, kind of going to the next chapter, Indian women were engaging with international suffrage conferences. And so there's lots of, kind of really reiterates, suffrage was really a global issue. Women around the world were thinking about campaigning, discussing issues around suffrage across the early 20th century. Even after Britain granted partial suffrage in 1918, there were lots of European countries who hadn't granted the vote for women. So the International Alliance for Suffrage had conferences every 3 years, where they would gather women from around the world to discuss kind of where they'd got to, how the campaigns were going, give each other advice and so forth. And so Indian women would attend those conferences as well. This is a picture from the 1919 Berlin conference, which Gillian helped me procure, so thank you, Gillian, for that. And what we see in the networks that Indian women were involved in the broader empire, and also in these international conferences, is that these Indian women were not, so what I should have said earlier is that I haven't set out to depict all of these Indian suffragettes as heroes or heroines. They had their faults, and we see that although these Indian women, were very brave, fighting for the vote under extreme pressure, they also themselves often replicated racial hierarchies as well, and they were also complicit sometimes in this. So we see in some of these international conferences, in their engagement with black Africans in Kenya and South Africa, that they often excluded and were complicit with white feminists in excluding the voices of Black, African and Aboriginal women's voices from these conferences, and didn't necessarily always think about how a lot of women were excluded from the franchise. So having looked at the ways in which, sorry, let me move on. I'm conscious of time, so I want to wrap up. Having looked at the ways in which Indian women engage with different parts of the world, I draw it all back together to look at the ways in which Indian women were engaging with the nationalist movement in India, and how this all kind of culminates then in Indian women getting the vote in 1949. Okay, so sorry, I'm aware of a kind of a muddled overview of everything that I want to say, but as I said, how do you condense this efficiently? I'm not sure. What I want to do, just to close this whole thing, is I'm just going to read the last 2 paragraphs of the whole book, which hopefully summarize my kind of key conclusions, and then I'm really happy to open up to questions and discussions. Okay. In the early 20th century, Indian women engaged in multiple networks, working and thinking internationally, carving out their own spaces within global dialogues about women's rights. These connections and identities were not confined to India or the imperial motherland, Britain. Indian women were able to find a voice and show how common suffrage issues were for women around the world. They may have shared some affinity with women from the East, but they did not always gravitate along racial lines. These women were not saints, but exhibited huge bravery in times of fierce imperial repression. And these transnational discussions around suffrage and political representation continued after India won equal suffrage rights following independence. And to put this into context, it was only in 2015 that women in Saudi Arabia were able to vote for the first time, albeit only in municipal elections, as the country is run nationally by an absolute monarchy. The Indian women's movement still faces challenges, as does the global women's movement. It is remarkable then that Indian women engaged so directly and forcefully with the suffrage movement at a time of colonial subjection. And it is also remarkable that they did so on the international stage, recognising the benefits of transnational networks to further their campaigns and to promote the position of Indian women as well as other women around the world. It is through their travel, correspondence, petitioning, marching and publishing that a range of Indian suffragettes were able to ensure that Indian women's rights were not overlooked either in India or in other parts of the world. They were able to empathise with women in other colonies, other parts of Asia and in the Western world. Despite various limitations, Indian suffragettes used their experiences and networks abroad to shape the political future of India with long-lasting legacies for the ways in which we understand and study political identities, activism and representation in the Indian subcontinent today.
Thank you. So thank you, Sumita, for some really rich reflections on your book. I think now is a good time to kind of open it out for questions and answers from the audience. I already see hands, this is great. Okay, so we'll start with you. Oh, we have a microphone as well? Yes, perfect.
I'm very interested in what you've spoken about, but also a contemporary, I believe she was a contemporary of Sophia Duleep Singh, was Cornelia Sorabji, who's an alumni of Oxford, who was the first woman to read law in Britain.
Yeah.
But I'm particularly interested because she was also involved in campaigning for the Perdonacine. And yet, my understanding is she also had huge problems with women's suffrage. And I just wondered what your thoughts were.
Yes, so that's right. So Cornelia Sorabji was the first woman of any ethnicity or nationality to study law at Oxford. She was at Somerville College. As I said, she was involved in her legal career after which she returned to India and she was very interested in promoting and looking after the plight of Penashins, women who were veiled and secluded. But she actually quite actively and publicly opposed granting Indian women the vote in India. I mean, this is not necessarily unusual. There was lots of opposition to suffrage by women in India and in other parts of the world, in Britain as well. It doesn't necessarily follow that just because you're a woman, you are a feminist or you campaign for these women, even though, of course, she was very interested in women's issues. So there's kind of a contradiction. She was obviously she was very interested in women's issues, but she was also very loyal to the British state. So a lot of even British suffrage campaigners would argue that Indian women were campaigning for the vote too quickly. They said, British women, have only just got the vote in 1918. You need to wait your time. You shouldn't be asking for the vote immediately. We have this long history of having a democratic institution in the Parliament for centuries in Britain, and you've only just had it for a few months. So there was lots of, and kind of more broadly, lots of opposition saying, and so one of the issues that Cornelia also had was that there's a high illiteracy rate among Indian women then and still now. So there were concerns that if women were uneducated, who were illiterate, how would they use that vote responsibly? So there were, very kind of huge concerns about whether the vote should be limited in some way, and it was actually limited to just women who passed literacy rates eventually later on, or just not giving them the vote yet, wait, let's have this in stages. So yes, Cornelia just thought they weren't quite ready at the time when she was writing about it.
Thank you. Yes, we're back.
Thanks. That was great. Thank you very much for presenting. I just had a question, which you sort of answered, about how homogenous the Indian suffrage activist movement was. And you've mentioned how they connected to other suffrage campaigns, but did they connect to any other activist campaigns? Because, just not just in India, but outside as well. Thanks.
So my general focus on this book is about the Indian women who leave India and who are thinking internationally and campaigning for the vote outside of India. So lots of Indian women who are doing lots of grassroots campaigning, who I'm kind of slightly less interested in. I talk a little bit less about. So the women that I look at are quite wealthy because they've got, either they have their own personal wealth or they've acquired the wealth in some way to be able to travel and engage with other women around the world, and they are generally literate in English, well spoken in English, also to be able to converse with all these other women. So those international women's conferences used to have, they would have both French and English at the same time, so they're kind of bilingual, but the Indian women would speak English rather than French. So generally quite wealthy, either come from middle class or actually upper class aristocratic backgrounds. But that's not to say that in India itself there weren't women of different classes and castes and religions involved. I would say on the religion, just because I mentioned it, what you do see though is a broad spectrum of religious backgrounds from the Indian women who are involved in these campaigns. And so it's not solely confined to one religion, and I mentioned how a lot of the politics in India was characterised by religious quotas, and especially in the early stages of the campaigns, Indian women were very adamant they didn't want religion to kind of pollute this kind of feminist cause, and it wasn't about division between religions, it was about united Indian womanhood who should campaign in for the votes. And kind of another thing, despite being quite elite, generally most of these Indian women were campaigning and arguing that they wanted universal suffrage for all women. And so kind of contradicting the kind of Communal Representation type argument about giving women who were educated the vote first. Generally, I mean, again, there's differences, but they were generally kind of saying all women should have the vote. In terms of other activism, yes, these women were not solely interested in suffrage at all. Suffrage was just one in a long list of issues that feminist campaigners were involved in and campaigning around in India, and these women were generally the kind of feminist campaigners who were involved in women's associations and organisations and interested in issues around maternal health, education and illiteracy, generally fighting around fights around nationalism and political independence. I guess though what you see and the focus of what I look at is that they're not necessarily kind of polluting them. So they are, when they are going to a suffrage conference, they're talking about suffrage. They're not kind of doing other things at the same time. You know, they can be quite single-minded around campaigns as well, and they kind of can see about, I guess, you know, sometimes it's the right time to concentrate on one particular issue, and so at certain points, they're kind of high points when they are just campaigning around suffrage.
Yeah, sure.
Hi. There's always a lot of talk these days about men acting as allies when it comes to women's equality in all aspects of society. To what extent did men act as allies or make any kind of positive contribution to the Indian suffrage movement, whether it was internationally or within India itself?
Great question. So this was fundamentally a cause that was taken up by women and women's associations and organisations. It was really led by 3 main women's organisations that were based in India, and the female members of them. But of course they needed male allies, or they recognised the need for male allies, and especially at a number of stages. I mean, so when they were campaigning for the provincial parliaments to give women the vote, they needed men who were in those parliaments to vote for them. So they were using them then. They, as I said, kind of very briefly, they were engaging very strongly with the kind of the main male political leaders of the Indian National Congress, which was the main nationalist body, or kind of political organisation in India at the time, as well as the Muslim League and other political organisations, really trying to get them all on board. They were very aware that the only way in which they could influence public opinion and the opinion of lawmakers in Britain was to show that it wasn't just women who wanted this. So they would gather letters of support from men and show them to politicians in Britain, say, look, it's not just us as well. So, yeah, male journalists as well. So they were using them in multiple ways.
Any further questions? Oh, yeah, sure, from the front.
It's really interesting to hear your reflections on kind of the nature and the hierarchies that existed in the international women's rights campaigning scene. I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts or opinions about how that might parallel or how it differs to modern day international women's rights movements and efforts.
Yeah. I guess it kind of goes back to the whole point about Britain being central to everything. And I should have said, like, I mean, I'm guilty of that as well. I'm not, you know, I'm British, so I also often place Britain at the centre of my world in the way which I see things and the way which I compare things. I think what you see in the interwar period, which is the kind of main focus of what I'm looking at, is that there's 2 things. There's I guess a kind of patronising attitude towards some of the Indian women who are getting involved in some of these conferences and associations and everything else. And what's interesting, to answer your question, what's interesting in the interwar period and women that I look at is I argue and I think that they were quite conscious of that, and they used that. So there were lots of discussions when they'd go to these conferences, and they would petition Parliament and so forth. A lot of discussion. Oh, look, you look so pretty. You've got a really nice sari on. Oh, look at your jewels, and it's so nice of you to have come here. How did you come here from India so far? Blah blah blah. And they would, I think they understood that it wasn't necessarily the right time to kind of challenge that, and they would often play on that. They would deliberately wear very bright saris that they wouldn't necessarily wear on that occasion normally. Because I think they knew that that was the way to get attention, to draw focus to what they were campaigning around, which I think is kind of different to perhaps the contemporary movement. Maybe I don't think contemporary feminists would want to be exoticized or orientalized in that way, or use that in that same way. But I guess, yeah, I think kind of contemporaries, and something I've talked about in various public arenas, is that so there's, again, two things here. So Indian women didn't always want help from other women around the world. They wanted to get publicity for what they were doing. They wanted to kind of get support and let people know and kind of share ideas, but they didn't necessarily want people to interfere and to take over. And I think that's kind of sometimes what you get now and you got then, is that very well-meaning feminists who are based in the Western world, who perhaps they do have more power and clout, will think that they can kind of take over these events, these kind of actions and activities. And I think that's kind of where you see some of the parallels going on there. That's one thing.
Were there, when they went to these like international conferences, was there any big differences between the circumstances of like Indian suffragettes and like suffragettes in other countries, in other powers, empires? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. It's a really weird thing, but you may have heard how India is a jewel of the crown. Is that the right word? Yeah. India was known as the jewel of the crown, and India held a special resonance to a lot of British people in the early 20th century, much more so than other parts of the empire. And you see that in the ways, especially and specifically in the ways in which British feminists or suffrage campaigners were engaging with these Indian women and in these international conferences in Britain and elsewhere, where kind of, do I have time? Yeah. And then, so when British women were campaigning for the vote in Britain for their own vote, they would often call up the image of the Indian woman as justification for the need for British women to have the vote in Britain. So it's totally separate from what's going on with Indian women, but just to give you a bit of background, if you don't mind. So British women would argue that, not all British women, but lots of British suffrage campaigners would argue that, or were conscious that getting a vote in Britain would mean having a say over what's going on in the rest of the empire. They were very conscious that a vote in the House of Commons, your MPs in Parliament in Westminster were often debating issues around empire, and so by having a vote, women have a say of what's going on over in empire. And so lots of British suffrage campaigners in their own suffrage newspapers and literature and so forth would invoke the image of the Indian woman who had a veil, was perhaps illiterate, had various other social reform issues, and say, this is the woman that we need to be saving and looking after. You need to give British women the vote here in Britain so that we can be involved in the political debates that are going on in Britain, and also therefore have a say and help those Indian women in India. So from the outset, from the very early stages of suffrage campaigns in Britain, Indian women were being invoked in ways in which women in other colonies were not invoked. And so a lot of this relates to, I said, kind of being jewel of the crown, lots of kind of easy easy kind of stereotypes about Indian women, which were perhaps less easy around other colonies. So it's very easy to talk about the veil, which you couldn't really talk about women in the Caribbean or Africa. You could talk about the religion and sati and immolation, all these things which have obviously been outlawed by then. But these were kind of the stereotypes which were kind of quite easy to hang on to. And so what you see going forward, once Indian women are being engaging and involved in these kind of these wider debates, that there's been that kind of interest and tie with Indian women from a long time, which hadn't been with other parts of the colonies, but also a sense of imperial, so I kind of said there's kind of an imperial racial hierarchy that was present in empire at the time, where if you think about the British Empire, Indians were above black Africans and black Afro-Caribbeans. So there was much more interest in giving Indian women the vote or engaging with Indian women around their campaigns than, so as much of the issues and concerns about Indian women not being ready for the vote, there was a general sense that African women, black African women, black women in the Caribbean were nowhere near being ready for votes. So they just weren't engaging with us until kind of 1930s. You know, Mars and others are kind of getting involved, but then still there's the racial stereotypes around black African women or black women more broadly are much more severe than the ones against Indian women. So it's a very long answer to your question.
Any additional questions? Oh, right at the back, and then we'll come to you.
Thank you. I was interested in your map showing the network of India in relation to other British colonies and overseas possessions, and particularly because, of course, Australia and New Zealand, women's suffrage was much earlier than the UK. Of course, we celebrate 1918, but that was actually male universal suffrage, and women's universal suffrage only came 10 years later. So I was wondering whether there was any linkage between women's suffrage in Australia and Canada and New Zealand and India, and also, sort of a slightly separate question, by the time of independence, was there really any prospect that there wouldn't be women's suffrage in India? Because there'd been a bit of a sea change from one side of the First World War to the other side. Men coming back from the war clearly had to have the vote, having so many of them died. And so almost, I went to another talk a while ago and I was asking why 1918? And I think the perception was, well, the men had to have the vote, now was the time to give the women the vote. So there are two questions really. Was there any linkage between Australia and India, New Zealand and India and so on? And by 1947, 1949, was there any chance that Indian women wouldn't get the vote?
Yeah, thank you. I'll answer the second one first. No, because Mahatma Gandhi had made a promise that once Indian independence was put in place, women would get the vote. So that was kind of had been put in place by the National Congress. But also, I mean, so it's not really about the war or anything else. It's about once India got independence, of course, Indian nationalists were in charge. B.R. Ambedkar, who's got a statue here in LSE, was kind of the architect of the Indian constitution. And in the late 40s, when you're putting together a constitution, it was kind of seen as fundamental that universal suffrage and equal rights should be enshrined in that constitution. I mean, Indian women had been very involved in the United Nations and the early years of the United Nations and the Equal Rights Declaration that the United Nations had put in place around equality for all people. So in the Indian context and in the context of the nationalist movement, yeah, there was definitely no chance of women being excluded. And also because there have been so many campaigns by the suffrage women for so many years. In terms of the links between Australia, New Zealand and India, in terms of suffrage, as you said, yes, Australia and New Zealand get the vote much, much earlier than Indian women or Britain do. But as I was saying earlier on, so there are some Indian women who go to Australia and New Zealand who give talks around what's going on in India, just to various Australian and New Zealand women's associations to get publicity and support. So there's kind of a sharing of ideas. There are also lots of so a lot of women from Australia and New Zealand were very involved in suffrage campaigns around the world, globally. A lot of them had relocated to Britain and were kind of, as in Britain, kind of the centre of lots of suffrage organisations in Britain. So they were interacting with Indian women in Britain, but they were Australian and New Zealand and Canadian women. But as I said when I was giving the talk as well, I guess the kind of issue that I would encourage us all to remember is that although New Zealand did enfranchise women of all races, Australia did not. So Australia deliberately excluded immigrants from having the vote in 1902, which included Indian men and women who lived in Australia as well. So a lot of these campaigns were linked to the Indian diaspora in Australia as well, who were campaigning for their own rights within Australia.
Thank you. Just to follow up with some of the things that have been discussed, really. In terms of the hierarchical imposition, which is racialised, is there also a sort of cognitive imperialism telling women from India how they should think about women's issues and suffrage? And if there was, is there a different networking of Indian women with women from places other than Britain, forming a different way of thinking about the issues that are affecting them and their lives? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, thank you. If I answered, yes. Yes, so a lot of British female well-wishers or campaigners who are interacting with Indian women, and not the majority, giving broad brush strokes it, but a lot of them told Indian women that they should, like Britain had only partially got the vote in 1918, and then 10 years later they got more. They said that you should do it in stages. Kind of going back to what I was saying before, this whole idea of doing it slowly, do it in stages. And you've got a few women franchised now. You can slowly increase, maybe decrease the property bar. So what lots of British women suggested was enfranchise the wives of male voters, which they did, and there's lots of outcry from Indian women around how this is anti-feminist, but anyway. And also, that's kind of saying, but listen to us. We have this experience. You should follow our lead. We should be the ones leading the petitions and the campaigns that you are engaging in. So that's kind of, I guess, the cognitive imperialism that's going on. And by the 1930s, Indian suffrage campaigners were quite furious with the ways in which some of these British women were interfering, and they used that word, interfering into their matters. It said there was this whole concern that they didn't understand the Indian situation and the campaigns, the grassroots campaigns that they were all involved in. So there is definitely a turning away from British feminists or women who are trying to help and engage with the Indian campaigners. In many ways, so I argue that a lot of this turning away is international. It's going to other places, but then you kind of in the kind of European international conferences, they see the same things going on, even though it's not as fierce, I guess, as it is in Britain. They kind of still see those hierarchies and cognitive imperialism going on. So they start turning to Asia. They start turning to their neighbours. They look to Japan and China and Sri Lanka and Burma and other countries and try and engage with kind of that region. But ultimately what happens is, especially by the 1940s, especially as the nationalist movement is just kind of ramping up, a lot of these women are being imprisoned not for their suffrage activities, but because of their nationalist activities. And so there's almost a kind of insular turning away from everyone, and a kind of an understanding that we've got to do this for ourselves now, and we're gonna get independence, and we're gonna get our suffrage. There's not, so although they're turning away from everyone, that's not to say they're not concerned about other women around the world. As I said, they're engaged with the United Nations. They're still thinking internationally and being broad-minded, but especially the campaigns become quite divorced from what's going on from British help.
A question there, and then we'll come to you.
Thank you for it's really interesting. I always like to point out that the first elected female head of state was in Sri Lanka, and and there have been female head of state of India well before the UK and many other countries in the world. And I was wondering about if, with your understanding of the Indian suffrage movement and with all the transnational networks, how that might have influenced the voting population's acceptance, seemingly readily accepting a female head of state. And I know there are lots of other complicated things, nuances about being the wife of a previous head of state, but and those women being able to become the head of state, and then and people voting for them, such a massive way before many other countries in the world who've had suffrage for a lot longer.
Yeah.
I was wondering your...
That's a really interesting question. I guess to kind of answer your question in a roundabout way, there were lots of campaigners who said that Indian men didn't like that British women were getting the vote. So kind of going back to something so different. And a lot of campaigners said, well, no, they're ruled by Queen Victoria. They're very used to having a woman rule over them. Why would they begrudge women getting the vote in Britain? It doesn't, and having a vote over what's going on in India. And India had, and as the Indian suffrage campaigners would argue time and time again, India had a long history of female rulers, not only just Queen Victoria, but within India itself. So many stories in its most recent past, but also going back centuries, of Indian women who were princess, kind of like actual royal rulers of princely states and regions in India, Rani of Jhansi. There's so many women who'd been leading regiments, who'd been involved in kind of military campaigns, political campaigns, who had been involved in all the kind of political machinations of kind of courtly law and rule and so forth in India. So there never seemed to be, or at least in the propaganda, there never seemed to be an issue with the idea of women, of a good woman who was of the right family and been born in kind of the right family, ruling over men and women. So I guess that's what you kind of see in India with Indira Gandhi, because she's from the right family, that's fine. And although someone then Sri Lanka is slightly different, of course, she's the wife, so it's totally okay. This is not your question, but I just kind of want to add a little bit to this. What you also see is that turnout in elections in India has been relatively high since independence. Okay, it's not amazing, but it's better than in Britain. And so high turnout of women and men and women in India continues today. So the multiple reasons for that. Elections in India now go on for a month or so. There are separate polling booths for men and women, so there are no issues that lots of campaigners in the 1920s and 30s had been arguing that Indian women can't have the vote because they don't want to go out and be in the same line as men or in the same booth, and so lots of spurious claims. But so you can see women vote separately from men. There's lots of if you just have to put your no. So on the kind of electoral sheets, you see the symbols of the parties really clearly. So if there are issues over illiteracy, at least you know who the voters know who the party is that they're voting for, so that hopefully overcomes some of the issues around illiteracy. And because there's a huge, for whatever reason, there's a huge interest in politics, and sometimes it's corrupt, and there are people who are forcing people to vote, and there's knows lots of corruption in the in lots of parts of the world. But I guess I think I would argue that the Indian population and the population in the subcontinent has been very engaged in politics, and it's kind of so that the leaders are not an issue, or haven't been an issue so far.
Maybe a question from the front.
Besides Sophia Dalip Singh, who were the other Indian women involved in the British suffrage movement? And do we have any idea of the numbers?
Yeah, a handful, really. So Sophia Dalip Singh, who was this daughter of an Indian prince born in Britain, she was very heavily involved in the British suffrage movement. Her sister Catherine was also involved in various suffrage fairs and demonstrations, not as much to the extent of her sister. And then they had, so Sophia was a so-called militant suffragette. Her sister Catherine was a peaceful suffragist. And then there were some Indian women who would speak at certain suffrage fairs and kind of rallies that took place in Britain, but I guess we know they spoke at those fairs, but we're not really sure if they were involved in anything beyond perhaps just being invited to speak at them. So there was actually someone who was an alumni, or at least she attended lectures at the LSE, Anusira Sarabhai. She spoke at she engaged in some suffrage kind of activities. There's someone called Ramdulari Dubey, who spoke at WF Women's Freedom League fair. And then there were, so that picture I showed earlier, which some of you may know of, the coronation procession which took place in 1911. There are some Indian women who went on that suffrage procession, who include Lalita Rai, Mrs. Bholanath, and Lalita Rai's daughter. So Lalita Rai is now one of the women on the suffrage plinth under Millicent Fawcett. But really, apart from Sophia and I would say perhaps her sister to an extent, there isn't evidence really of women of Indian ethnicity or women of other ethnicity other than white who were kind of really involved in that kind of actual day-to-day campaigning that took place in Britain. So we said there are a few Indian women who are invited to speak at a few events, but they weren't really involved in the campaigns to a much larger extent.
Thanks. Okay, so any final last questions? Okay, you can have the final one.
Thank you. You mentioned that Indian women came to Britain to lobby and so on. Who were they trying to influence? Were they just aiming at the politicians? Did they want to influence public opinion?
Both. So they wanted to influence the politicians, but they knew they had to influence and lobby public opinion as well in order for the MPs to listen to that public opinion. So they would. So numerous cases of different Indian women who would talk at various meetings, women's meetings, Quakers meetings, just general non-political meetings, and they would often encourage those meetings to pass resolutions to say we are in support of the Indian suffrage movement or whatever the specific issue around suffrage that they were campaigning for around that time, and that they would encourage the people in those public meetings to then, please will you write to your MP, send them this copy of the resolution that we have just passed at this meeting, and also encourage your MP